Colorado Territory, 1873. The wind howled across the plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the acrid scent of smoke that hung over what remained of the Turner homestead. Grace Turner stood motionless, her ash-smudged fingers clutching the charred remnant of a wooden picture frame. At 22, she had already weathered more tragedy than most faced in a lifetime. Her honey-blonde hair whipped around her face, escaped from what had been a neat braid that morning. The blue calico dress she wore, her best, and now her only, fluttered against her slender frame. "Nothing worth saving," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Just like everything else in my life." Grace had learned young that the frontier was merciless to those who dared to dream. First, it had taken her parents to cholera when she was 16. Then, her husband of barely a year to a mining accident. Now, lightning had struck their barn during last night's storm, and the fire had claimed everything she'd rebuilt. Her false belief had been confirmed once more. To survive the West, you could depend on nothing but yourself, and even then, the land would eventually take everything you loved. 2 miles away, Heath Kincaid guided his horse along the ridge overlooking the valley. At 25, he'd already established himself as one of the most reliable hands at the Rockingham Ranch, though he harbored dreams of his own spread someday. His lean, muscular frame spoke of years of hard work, and his face, handsome with its strong jawline and kind blue eyes, was shadowed by the brim of his hat, but clean-shaven from his weekly ritual. Heath believed in order, in discipline, in the power of a man's word. What he didn't believe in was attachment. The orphan son of settlers killed in a Comanche raid when he was 12, Heath had been taken in by a series of ranchers who valued his growing skill with horses but offered little by way of family. He'd learned that relationships were temporary comfort that inevitably led to pain. The frontier required focus, not feelings. That conviction had served him well, until he saw the column of smoke rising from the Turner place. "Come on, Major," he urged his bay gelding, spurring him toward the dissipating smoke. He told himself he was simply being a good neighbor, the way frontier folk were supposed to be. It had nothing to do with the widow Turner, whose quiet dignity had caught his attention at church socials, or whose rare smile made something tighten in his chest. Grace was sifting through the ruins of what had been her kitchen when she heard the approaching hoofbeats. Instinctively, her hand moved to the pocket of her dress where she kept a small derringer. Another hard lesson of frontier life. "Mrs. Turner?" Heath's voice carried over the wind as he dismounted, hat in hand. "I saw the smoke from the ridge." When she turned, Heath felt something twist inside him. Her face was streaked with soot and tears, yet she stood straight-backed, chin lifted in defiance of her circumstances. "Mr. Kincaid," she acknowledged, her voice steadier than she felt. "As you can see, I've had some trouble." Heath surveyed the destruction. The small house was gone, along with the barn and the modest corral. Even the chicken coop had burned. By some miracle, a few chickens pecked nervously at the edge of the property, and a confused milk cow lowed from where she'd been grazing in the far pasture. "Was anyone hurt?" he asked, though he could see she was alone. "No," Grace replied, the word hollow. "Just me here now, and I was able to get out." She gestured vaguely at the ruins. Not that there was much to save. Heath stepped closer, noting the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders trembled with the effort of remaining upright. "You need to sit down, Mrs. Turner. When's the last time you ate?" Grace opened her mouth to dismiss his concern, but the world suddenly tilted. Heath moved with surprising speed, catching her before she hit the ground. The contact, his strong arms supporting her, the solid warmth of his chest, shocked her. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with kindness. "I'm fine," she insisted, though she made no move to pull away. "You're not," Heath countered, gently guiding her to a fallen log at the edge of the property. "And that's all right. No one would be, after this." The simple acknowledgement of her circumstance, free of pity or judgment, cracked something in Grace's carefully maintained composure. A sob escaped before she could stop it, and then another. "I can't start over again," she whispered. "I've lost everything. Every time I build something, it gets taken away." Heath knelt before her, his blue eyes intent on hers. "Not everything, Mrs. Turner. You've still got yourself, that cow, some chickens." He paused, then added quietly, "And right now, you've got me." It was this unexpected kindness, offered without expectation, That marked the true beginning of their story. Heath didn't leave that day. Instead, he helped Grace round up her remaining livestock, fashioned a crude shelter from salvaged timber, and rode to his bunkhouse to bring back food and blankets. His foreman at the Rocking Inn granted him 3 days to help the widow Turner get sorted, a generosity that spoke to the unspoken code of the frontier. In times of disaster, neighbors stepped up. Those 3 days changed everything. As they worked side by side to salvage what they could, Heath discovered in Grace a resilience that both impressed and troubled him. No one should have to be that strong, he thought, watching her methodically sort through the ashes for anything usable, her face set in determination even as exhaustion shadowed her eyes. For Grace, Heath's steady presence was both comforting and unsettling. She had grown accustomed to handling crises alone, to being the only one she could depend on. His quiet competence, his lack of empty platitudes, and most of all, his respect for her determination to rebuild, challenged her belief that isolation was the only safe way to live. On the 3rd day, as they sat sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread in the makeshift shelter, Grace voiced the question that had been troubling her. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Kincaid? You hardly know me." Heath considered her question, his eyes on the fire. "When I was 12, after my parents were killed, a stranger found me hiding in the creek bed. He was a trapper, headed north. Could have left me, probably should have. Instead, he took me to the nearest settlement, made sure I had shelter." He looked up at her. I asked him the same question. Know what he said? Grace shook her head. He said, "Out here, we're all just one bad day from needing someone. Today was yours. Tomorrow might be mine." Heath shrugged. "Seems like sense to me." In that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition of shared understanding that went beyond words. Both had learned to expect little from life, to protect themselves from hope. Yet here they were, finding unexpected connection in the aftermath of disaster. The next morning, as Heath prepared to return to his regular duties, he made a proposal that would alter both their paths. "The Johnson place, 3 miles east. Old couple died last winter, no heirs. Cabin small but sound. It's been empty since. I know the land agent. If you're willing, I could speak to him about you taking it over, at least temporarily." Grace's pride warred with her practicality. "I have no money for rent. The place needs looking after. Someone to keep it from falling to ruin while they find a buyer." Heath's gaze was steady. It would be an arrangement, not charity. 2 days later, Grace found herself standing in the doorway of a small but sturdy cabin, her few remaining possessions, the cow, chickens, a trunk of linens miraculously spared from the fire, and the clothes on her back, all she had to show for her years of struggle. But for the first time since the fire, perhaps longer, she felt something like hope. The Johnson place became a turning point. Through the remainder of summer and into fall, Heath rode over whenever his duties allowed, helping with repairs, bringing supplies, and gradually, almost without either of them noticing, becoming a constant in Grace's life. Their conversations, awkward at first, grew easier. He learned about her childhood in Missouri, her brief marriage to a man who'd been kind but whom she'd never truly loved. She discovered his dreams of a horse ranch, his self-taught literacy from treasured books he carried in his saddlebags. For Heath, each visit challenged his long-held belief that attachments were dangerous distractions. He found himself thinking of Grace during long days working cattle, wondering if she'd managed to fix the leak in the roof, if she was eating enough. The concern bothered him. It was unfamiliar, this worry for another, but he couldn't seem to stop it. Grace, meanwhile, found herself watching the Eastern Trail each evening, a flutter of anticipation when she spotted a rider that she told herself was merely practical. Heath brought news, supplies, human connection. That was all. She couldn't afford to need more. Their careful dance of growing affection but deliberate distance might have continued indefinitely had winter not arrived early and harsh in November. A blizzard swept across the territory without warning, stranding Heath at Grace's cabin as he'd stopped to deliver firewood on his way back to the ranch. "You'll have to stay," Grace said, practical despite the flush in her cheeks as she realized the impropriety of their situation. "No one would expect you to ride in this." They passed the evening in unexpected comfort, sharing stories as the wind howled outside. Heath spoke more than he usually did, telling her of his time with various ranches, the characters he'd met, the skills he'd learned. Grace found herself laughing for the first time in months at his deadpan description of a cattle drive gone comically wrong. As the fire burned low and the hour grew late, an intimacy born of isolation settled over them. Heath, seated at her small table while she washed their dishes, asked the question he'd been avoiding. "What will you do come spring, Mrs. Turner?" Grace stilled, her hands in the wash basin. "I don't know," she admitted. "The land agent says they'll likely sell this place by then. I have some savings, but not enough for land of my own." She turned to face him. "And please, after all this time, I think you might call me Grace." Heath nodded, oddly moved by this small permission. Grace, then. The way he said her name, soft, almost reverent, sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "And you?" she asked, desperate to shift attention away from her reaction. "Will you stay at the Rockingham?" "No," Heath said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I've saved enough for a small start. Thought I'd look for land come spring, focus on horses rather than cattle." He hesitated, then added, "It's a hard life, starting from scratch. Harder alone." The implication hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Before either could pursue the conversation further, a sound from outside drew their attention. The frightened whinny of Heath's horse, followed by something that raised the hair on their necks, the distinctive howl of wolves, close and hungry. Heath was on his feet instantly, reaching for his coat. "The shed's not secure enough. They'll go for the livestock." Grace grabbed her shawl. "The shotgun's by the door." Together they battled through snow nearly to their knees, the wind cutting like knives through their clothing. The small shed where Heath's horse and Grace's cow were sheltered was already under assault, dark shapes circling as the panicked animals inside kicked at the walls. What followed was a desperate struggle against both predators and elements. Heath fired warning shots while Grace worked to secure the damaged door of the shed. In the chaos, neither saw the wolf that had circled behind until it lunged at Grace, teeth bared. Heath's shout of warning came simultaneously with his movement, throwing himself between Grace and the attacking animal. The wolf's teeth sank into his forearm as they tumbled into the snow, Heath grappling to keep the snarling jaws from his throat. Grace didn't hesitate. Grabbing a piece of firewood, she swung with all her strength, striking the wolf's head with a sickening crack. The animal yelped and released Heath, staggering away before collapsing in the snow. The rest of the pack, deterred by the gunfire and the fall of their member, melted back into the storm, leaving an eerie silence broken only by their labored breathing and the continuing howl of the wind. "You're hurt," Grace gasped, seeing the blood seeping through Heath's torn sleeve. "Not badly," he assured her, though the pain in his voice belied his words. They retreated to the cabin, where Grace's hands trembled as she cleaned and bound his wound by firelight. The bite was deep but clean, and Heath bore her ministrations stoically, though he couldn't suppress a wince when she applied her homemade salve. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her fingers gentle on his skin. "Don't be," Heath replied, his gaze intent on her face. "You saved my life out there." Grace shook her head, her throat tight with emotion she couldn't name. "You put yourself between me and that wolf. Why would you do that?" The question hung between them, weighted with all the things neither had been brave enough to say. Heath looked at her, really looked at her, and for once, allowed himself to acknowledge the truth. "Because the thought of you being hurt was worse than any pain I could feel myself." The simplicity of his answer, the raw honesty in his voice, broke through the carefully constructed walls around Grace's heart. Before she could reconsider, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a kiss born of fear, relief, and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. Heath froze for an instant, surprised, before his uninjured arm came around her, drawing her closer as he returned her kiss with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Heath rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he said, though he made no move to release her. "It's still storming," Grace pointed out, practical even as her heart raced. "And you're injured. If I stay, I want you to stay," she whispered, the admission costing her more courage than facing the wolves had. "Not just tonight." The blizzard lasted 3 days, during which their isolation created a world apart from the rules and expectations of frontier society. They spoke of dreams long suppressed, of fears that had shaped their lives, of losses that had hardened them against hope. And in doing so, they began to dismantle the false beliefs that had kept them both lonely for so long. For Heath, the revelation came on the second night, as Grace dozed against his shoulder before the fire. Looking down at her, this woman who had endured so much yet remained gentle, who had learned to stand alone yet still reached for connection, he realized the flaw in his thinking. The frontier wasn't about surviving in isolation. It was about building something worth fighting for, worth the risk of loss. For Grace, the moment of truth arrived the following morning, waking to find Heath already up, making coffee in her small kitchen as if he belonged there. The domesticity of it, the rightness, shook her. Her belief that love was a luxury the frontier didn't allow was crumbling in the face of evidence to the contrary. When the storm finally broke, reality reasserted itself. Heath needed to return to the ranch, to explain his absence and fulfill his obligations. Their parting was awkward, neither certain how to translate what had happened between them into the practical world beyond the cabin's walls. "I'll come back in 3 days," Heath promised, his hand lingering on hers. "I'll be here," Grace replied, forcing a smile despite the fear that once he left, the spell would break. But Heath did return, and with news that would upend their tentative new understanding. "I gave my notice at the ranch," he announced without preamble as he dismounted. "And I found land, 160 acres along the creek, 10 miles south. Good water, decent grazing, some timber." His eyes, usually so steady, held an uncertainty she'd never seen. "I'm taking it." Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. "That's wonderful news. You're achieving your dream." Heath stepped closer, his gaze intent. "Part of it," he corrected. "But I found something recently that made me realize my dream was incomplete." He took her hands in his. "I don't want land without someone to build it with. I don't want a home that's empty when I return to it." Grace's heart thundered in her chest, hope warring with ingrained caution. "What are you saying, Heath?" "I'm saying I love you, Grace Turner. I'm saying that everything I want to build with you." He dropped to one knee in the snow, still holding her hands. "Will you marry me? Not just for practicality, not just for survival, but because I believe we could have something better together than either of us could alone." Grace stared down at him. This man who had entered her life when she had nothing, who had seen her at her lowest, yet looked at her as if she were precious. The last of her resistance, the belief that the frontier would inevitably take whatever she loved, crumbled in the face of his certainty. "Yes," she whispered, then laughed, a sound of pure joy that startled them both. "Yes, I will marry you, Heath Kincaid." They were married by the circuit preacher 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the Rockingham Ranch, attended by Heath's fellow cowboys and a few neighbors who had helped Grace after the fire. It wasn't the future either had imagined for themselves, but as they exchanged vows, both recognized it was the future they had needed. Their new beginning wasn't without challenges. The land Heath had purchased was raw, untamed. The small cabin they constructed that winter was crude compared even to the Johnson place. The work was endless, the uncertainties many. But for the first time, neither faced those challenges alone. Spring brought with it both hope and an unexpected crisis. Heath had ridden to town for supplies, leaving Grace to tend to their first mare about to foal. What should have been a routine delivery turned dangerous when the foal presented wrong, and Grace found herself alone with a decision to make that could cost them their first investment. Hours later, when Heath returned to find both mare and foal alive, Grace exhausted but triumphant, he realized with startling clarity how close he had come to missing this life. Had he held to his belief that attachment was weakness, had he not reached out to her after the fire, he would be somewhere else now, still alone, still convinced that was the only safe way to live. Instead, he had a wife who matched his strength and courage, a small herd beginning to take shape, and land that was slowly responding to their care. They had, against all expectations, found home in each other. Their true test came the following autumn, when word reached them that Jeb Reed, a notorious land grabber from the Wyoming Territory, had set his sights on the Creek Valley where their small ranch lay. Reed's methods were infamous: intimidation, arson, and when those failed, outright violence. Several smaller ranchers had already sold out rather than face his hired guns. "We should consider it," Grace said one evening. after reports came that the Miller place 3 miles north had been burned out. Selling, I mean. We could go further west, start over. Heath looked up from the harness he was mending, studying her face in the lamplight. Is that what you want to do? Grace hesitated. I want us to be safe, she admitted. I've lost everything once before. I couldn't bear to lose what we've built. To lose you. Setting aside his work, Heath moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his as he had that snowy day when he proposed. That's your fear talking, not your heart, he said gently. The Grace I know doesn't run from threats. She faces them. This isn't just a wolf or a storm, Heath. These are men who kill for profit. And this isn't just land, he countered. It's our home. The future we're building. His hands tightened on hers. I won't force you to stay if you truly want to go. But I don't think either of us could be happy knowing we gave up without a fight. The truth of his words resonated within her. They had both spent too long believing that loss was inevitable, that happiness was temporary. Giving in to Reed would be surrendering to that old fear, the belief that everything they loved would eventually be taken. No, she said, a new resolve straightening her spine. We stay, we fight. Their stand against Reed's tactics became a rallying point for the valley. Other small ranchers, inspired by the Kincaids' refusal to be driven out, formed an alliance. They established watches, shared resources, and presented a united front that Reed hadn't anticipated. The confrontation came to a head on a crisp October morning, when Reed himself, accompanied by 3 hired guns, rode onto the Kincaid property. Heath met them in the yard, rifle ready but not raised, while Grace watched from the porch, her own shotgun within reach. You're the one causing all the trouble, Reed observed, his gaze dismissive as it swept over the modest homestead. Don't look worth dying for to me. Then we see different things, Heath replied evenly. I see a home, a future, something worth protecting. Reed's laugh was cold. Noble sentiment. Won't stop bullets. Perhaps not, came a new voice, and Reed turned to find the yard suddenly occupied by mounted men, the neighboring ranchers, arriving as planned when the signal smoke was raised. But there are more of us than you, Reed. And unlike your hired guns, we're fighting for our homes. The standoff lasted tense minutes before Reed, recognizing the shift in advantage, grudgingly withdrew. His parting threat, "This isn't over, Kincaid," lingered in the air, but the immediate danger had passed. The alliance had held. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the valley gold, Grace leaned against Heath's shoulder, a contentment she had once thought impossible settling deep in her bones. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked. Heath's arm tightened around her. "Possibly. Men like Reed don't give up easily." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "But neither do we." "No," she agreed, smiling up at him. "We don't." In that moment, both recognized how far they had come from the wounded souls who had believed that the frontier allowed no room for love or hope. The truth, they had learned, was quite the opposite. It was precisely the harshness of the frontier that made connection not just possible but essential. Spring arrived with the news that Reed had moved on to easier targets in Montana territory, and with it came another, more personal joy. Grace was expecting their first child. As Heath laid his hand on her still flat stomach, wonder and terror mingling in equal measure, he marveled at how completely his life had transformed in less than 2 years. "Are you afraid?" Grace asked softly, reading his expression. "Terrified," he admitted with a rueful smile. "But not the way I used to be. Not afraid of loving, of losing. Just the normal fear of wanting to do right by our child." Grace covered his hand with hers. "We will," she assured him. Together. 5 years after the fire that had taken everything Grace owned, the Kincaid Ranch stood as testament to what could be built from ashes. The herd of quality horses was growing, the repayment of Heath's initial loan nearly complete. The cabin had expanded to a proper house, with a room ready for the child who would arrive by summer's end. Most importantly, the deep connection between them had only strengthened through each challenge faced and overcome. On the anniversary of the day they had met, that smoke-filled morning when everything had seemed lost, they rode together to a hilltop overlooking their land. Below, the creek glinted in the sunlight, horses grazed in the meadow, and their house stood solid against the backdrop of distant mountains. "Hard to believe," Grace murmured, one hand resting on her rounded belly. "That day, I thought I had nothing left, that I was alone. Heath reached across to take her hand, his wedding band catching the light. You had more than you knew, he said simply. You had courage, strength, and he added with a smile that still made her heart skip, you had me. Grace returned his smile, thinking of how wrong they had both been. The frontier wasn't a place where love couldn't survive. It was a place where love was most necessary, most transformative, where two people who had believed themselves destined for isolation could find in each other not just survival, but joy. I had everything that mattered, she agreed, squeezing his hand. I just didn't know it yet. Together they watched the sun begin its descent, painting their hard-won home in gold, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them as they had faced all others, side by side, their false beliefs long abandoned, replaced by the truth they had discovered in each other's arms.